Episode 10 Kalmistu, The Days of the Dead. Twice a year, the boundary between the living and the dead grew thin. Not metaphorically thin, not symbolically permeable, but genuinely, tangibly, experientially thin, so thin that a family could sit on the grave of their grandfather and speak to him as if he were present. So thin that food left on a tombstone would be consumed, not by birds or rain but by the dead themselves. So thin that you could feel the presence of those who had gone before, could sense their participation in the feast, could know with certainty that death was not ending but transformation, not absence but different presence. This happened in autumn, when leaves fell and darkness lengthened, on Kekri Saturday, the old harvest festival that marked the year's transition from light to dark, from abundance to scarcity, from the world of growth to the world of rest. And it happened in spring, when the earth awakened from winter's sleep, on Easter Tuesday, the day when Orthodox Christians celebrated resurrection, when life's triumph over death was not merely theological doctrine but lived reality, enacted in graveyards where the dead and living feasted together. Stand with me in a graveyard near Kumala, on a late autumn day when the Kekri feast is about to begin. The leaves are indeed falling, birch leaves golden, scattered across the ground like coins of light. The air is cold but not yet winter cold, crisp with the smell of frost and earth and the first hints of snow to come. Families arrive carrying baskets and bundles. They spread blankets on graves. They set out food, bread and salt, meat and cheese, pastries and preserves, bottles of wine and spirits. They light candles at the headstones or simple wooden crosses that mark the graves. And then they sit, and they eat, and they speak to the dead as if the dead could hear, because they believe the dead can hear, do hear, are present and participating in this communion across the boundary of mortality. This is Kalmistu, the graveyard. This is pomiluttaminen, the practice of mourning that is also celebration. This is the days of the dead, when the living gather to feed their ancestors, to maintain bonds that death cannot sever, to enact the profound truth that community includes not just those currently breathing but everyone who has ever been part of the family, the village, the endless chain of generations. This is one of the most beautiful and moving traditions Theodor Schwint encountered in his 1879 journey through the Lake Ladoga region. And it is a tradition that, by his time, was already fading, still practiced by the old believers, the Orthodox Karelians who maintained the ancient customs, but viewed with increasing suspicion by church authorities and dismissed as superstition by the modernizing young. Let us sit with the feast. Let us honor the dead. Let us understand what was meant when people said, the dead are never truly gone, they live on just the same. The calendar of death. The Orthodox Christian liturgical year, especially as practiced in rural Karelia, was punctuated by specific days devoted to remembering and honoring the dead. But the two most important, the days when graveyards became feast grounds, were Kekri Saturday in autumn and Easter Tuesday in spring. Kekri was an ancient harvest festival, pre-Christian in origin, that marked the end of the agricultural year. All crops had to be harvested by Kekri, all animals that would not be kept through winter had to be slaughtered, all preparations for winter had to be complete. After Kekri came the dark months, when the earth slept and human activity turned inward. The Kekri celebration was complex, involving household rituals, community feasting, and, crucially for our purposes, visits to graveyards to feast with the dead. The specific day varied somewhat by region and over time, but it typically fell in late October or early November, time to coincide with the Orthodox feast of Demetrius of Thessaloniki or All Saints' Day. The logic of visiting the dead at Kekri made profound sense. The harvest was complete, the living had gathered their sustenance for winter, it was time to share that abundance with those who had gone before, to thank the ancestors for their blessings, to ensure that the dead knew they were not forgotten even as the living prepared to endure the dark months. Easter Tuesday, the Tuesday of Bright Week, the week immediately following Easter Sunday, was the spring counterpart to the autumn Kekri feast. If Kekri marked the descent into darkness and death, Easter marked the emergence into light and life. Resurrection was the theme, and what better way to celebrate resurrection than to visit the dead and feast with them, enacting the belief that death is not final, that the dead live on, that Easter's promise applies not just to Christ but to all the faithful. The timing, Tuesday rather than Sunday, is significant in Orthodox tradition. Easter Sunday itself was the highest holy day, spent in church and in solemn celebration. The following week, Bright Week, continued the Easter celebration with each day having particular significance. Tuesday became the designated day for visiting graves, for the more folk-oriented, communal practices that complemented the formal liturgical celebrations. Twice a year, then, once as the world died into winter, once as it was born anew in spring, the people gathered at the graveyards. The symmetry was beautiful: death and life, autumn and spring, darkness and light, mourning and celebration. The cycle turned, and the dead were honored in both its descending and ascending arcs. The graveyards of Lake Ladoga. The song mentions specific graveyards, each with its own character and history, each holding the dead of particular communities. Cumula's two graveyards represented the division in the community. Cumula, as we've discussed in earlier episodes, had been an important settlement. The presence of two separate burial grounds might indicate two different religious communities, Orthodox and Lutheran, perhaps, or Old Believer and Mainstream Orthodox, or simply two different areas of the village using separate locations, or earlier and later burial grounds as the village expanded. The fact that both were sites of the Kekri and Easter feast suggests that whatever divisions existed among the living, the practices of honoring the dead transcended them. Both graveyards saw families gathering, food being shared, bonds with ancestors being maintained. Sarola's ancient site we've encountered before, the island where a church once stood before being destroyed in the wars. The graveyard there was old, holding generations of dead, going back to times before the current inhabitants could remember. Feasting at such an ancient site connected the living not just to their immediate ancestors but to the deep past, to the entire lineage of people who had lived in this landscape. Elisenvara's sandhill was a graveyard notable for its sandy soil, easier to dig than the rocky soil common elsewhere, but also more prone to erosion. Storms and time might expose bones, making the presence of the dead more visceral, more immediate. A graveyard where the dead were literally emerging from the earth created a particular atmosphere for the feast. Kanansari's graves were on the island where the monastery had once stood. We discussed in the Bells Beneath the Water episode how this holy island retained its sacred character even after the monastery's destruction. The graveyard there would have held monks and lay people, centuries of burials, making it a particularly powerful location for communing with the dead. Lapinlahti's churchyard, where the lake forever laves, a beautiful image of water constantly washing the shore near the graveyard, the eternal movement of the lake contrasting with and complementing the eternal rest of the dead. The sound of waves would have been the constant background to the feast, a reminder of natural cycles and eternity. Each of these graveyards had its own character, its own accumulated history, its own community of dead waiting to be visited, fed, remembered. And each, on Kekri Saturday and Easter Tuesday, transformed from a place of silent burial into a place of active communion, from memento mori into celebration of continued relationship. The feast itself. What actually happened when families gathered at the graveyards? The sources Schwint collected describe feasting, from morning unto night. This was not a brief visit but an extended gathering, families spending the entire day in the graveyard. They brought food, real food, substantial food, the kind you would serve at any significant feast. Bread, the staff of life. Wine and spirits, both for drinking and for pouring out as libations on the graves. Meat, perhaps from animals slaughtered at Kekri. Pastries and special dishes prepared specifically for this occasion. Cheese, preserved fruits, whatever the family's resources allowed. This food was not merely symbolic. Families actually ate it, consuming real meals in the graveyard. But they also shared it with the dead, leaving portions on graves, speaking as if offering food to the deceased. Here, grandmother, I brought your favorite bread. Here, father, taste this wine. The sharing was both literal and metaphorical. Literally, food was left on graves and would disappear, consumed by birds and weather if not by spirits. Metaphorically, the act of eating while sitting on or near a grave, of speaking to the dead while consuming food, created a sense of shared meal, of the dead being present at the table even if they could not physically eat. This practice, pomiluttaminen, combined mourning. Pomilutta means to mourn, to lament, with celebration. There was genuine grief, especially at fresh graves, especially for those recently lost. Families would weep, would speak of their sorrow, would express their pain at separation. But there was also joy. Old stories would be told about the deceased, not maudlin tales but funny reminiscences, character quirks, memorable moments. Wine would flow and tongues would loosen. Laughter would mix with tears. The feast was not morbid but vital, not depressing but affirming. Kalmistu, in the graveyard, where the old believers sleep/we maintain the ancient customs that we swore to always keep/pomiluttamasa, mourning, but also celebrate/the eternal cycle turning, the living and the late. This duality, mourning and celebration together, captures something profound about healthy relationships with death. The dead are mourned because loss is real. But they are also celebrated because their lives were real, because their influence continues, because death is not obliteration but transformation. The feasts lasted all day. As morning turned to afternoon and afternoon to evening, as candles were lit against the gathering darkness, as the wine bottles emptied and the food was consumed or left as offerings, the boundary between living and dead became increasingly permeable in the consciousness of the feastgoers. This was when the dead felt most present. This was when a mother might swear she heard her deceased child's voice on the wind. When a widow might feel her husband's presence so strongly she would turn, expecting to see him. When the veil between worlds grew so thin that seeing and believing merged, and the dead were simply there, participating, present, part of the feast. The theology of communion. What belief system made these graveyard feasts sensible, even necessary, to the people who practiced them? At the foundation was a rejection of the idea that death creates absolute separation. The dead were gone from sight, yes, but not gone from existence, not removed from relationship, not cut off from the community that had been theirs in life. In Orthodox Christian theology, this belief is supported by the doctrine of the communion of saints, the idea that the Church includes all believers, living and dead, united in mystical body. Prayer for the dead and to the saints, the dead who have achieved holiness, are standard Orthodox practices, based on the understanding that death does not sever the bonds of Christian community. But the Karelian graveyard feasts went beyond official theology into something more visceral, more folk-oriented, more rooted in pre-Christian understandings of the relationship between living and dead. In many pre-Christian Northern European belief systems, the dead were understood as remaining close to the living, residing in their graves or in nearby spirit realms, maintaining interest in their family's welfare, capable of helping or harming the living depending on how they were treated. This created obligations. The living owed the dead honor, remembrance, and material sustenance, through offerings at graves. In return, the dead provided blessing, protection, and continuity. They were the ancestors, the ones who had built what the living now inhabited, whose wisdom and experience could guide current generations. The graveyard feasts perfectly enacted this reciprocal relationship. The living brought food, offered it to the dead, demonstrated that they remembered and honored those who came before. The dead, in accepting these offerings, at least in the understanding of believers, provided blessing and protection to their descendants. The twice-yearly timing reinforced the cyclical understanding of existence. Life and death were not opposites but phases in a cycle. The living would become dead, the dead had once been living. The cycle turned eternally, and the feasts marked its turning, autumn's descent into death, spring's emergence into life, both times appropriate for communion across the boundary. The phrase, veknaya pamyat, eternal memory, appears in the song and in Orthodox memorial services. It's both a prayer, may their memory be eternal, and a promise, we will remember eternally. The graveyard feasts enacted this eternal memory in the most literal way possible, by gathering at the graves, by speaking the names of the dead, by telling their stories, by feeding them. The living ensured that memory would continue, that the dead would not be forgotten. As long as the feasts continued, the dead lived in memory. And in Orthodox Karelian belief, to live in memory was a form of life itself, perhaps the only immortality most people could aspire to. Speaking to the dead. One of the most striking aspects of the graveyard feasts was the directness with which the living addressed the dead. This was not abstract prayer or formal liturgy, though there might be prayers and liturgical elements as well. This was conversation, one-sided perhaps, but real, immediate, personal. A daughter might sit by her mother's grave and talk to her, "Mother, I brought your favorite bread, the kind you always made for Easter. I miss you. The children are growing well. Your grandson has your eyes. I wish you could see him." A son might speak to his father, "Father, the harvest was good this year. I used your methods, the way you taught me. The farm is doing well. I'm taking care of Mother. She still speaks of you every day." This kind of direct address assumes the dead can hear, can understand, can care about the information being shared. It treats the dead as present participants in family life rather than distant memories. The psychological and emotional value of such practice is significant. Grief often includes things unsaid, conversations we never had, words we wish we'd spoken before death intervened. The graveyard feast provided opportunity to speak those words, to say what needed saying, to continue the dialogue that death had interrupted. For Orthodox Christians, this was supported by the belief in prayer for the dead. If the dead could benefit from prayers, they must be able to hear those prayers, must have some form of consciousness that persists after bodily death. Speaking to them was not superstition but an extension of prayer, a form of maintaining relationship across the boundary of mortality. But the practice also had deeper, perhaps older roots in ancestor veneration, the understanding that the dead remain part of the family, retain interest in family affairs, deserve to be kept informed about what's happening with their descendants. The feasts created space and time specifically for this communication. The graveyard, on these particular days, became a meeting ground where the dead could be addressed directly, where the living could speak without feeling foolish, where the boundary between worlds was understood to be permeable enough that communication could flow across it. The material and the spiritual. One of the fascinating tensions in the graveyard feast tradition is the balance between material and spiritual elements. On one hand, these were deeply spiritual practices, communing with the dead, honoring ancestors, enacting beliefs about the afterlife and the continuity of existence across death. On the other hand, they were intensely material, real food consumed, real wine drunk, real bodies sitting on real graves in real graveyards. This materiality was not incidental but essential. The dead were not abstract spirits but were understood as retaining some connection to their physical remains, to the graves where their bodies rested. The living did not communicate with the dead through pure meditation or prayer alone but through the offering of material goods, food, wine, objects placed on graves. This reflects a worldview that does not sharply separate material from spiritual, that understands the physical world as interpenetrated with spiritual reality, that sees no contradiction between feasting on bread and wine while simultaneously communing with invisible ancestors. From a modern secular perspective, we might be tempted to reduce the practice to its psychological or social functions, saying the dead are fed is really just a metaphor for remembering them, or the feasts are really just about community cohesion among the living. But this reduction misses something important. For the practitioners, the material and spiritual dimensions were genuinely both present and both real. The food fed the living bodies and also fed the dead spirits. The wine sustained the living and also honored the ancestors. The feast was simultaneously a meal and a sacrament, simultaneously social gathering and mystical communion. This integration of material and spiritual is characteristic of Orthodox Christian theology, which emphasizes the sanctification of matter through divine presence, as in the Eucharist, where bread and wine become body and blood. But it also reflects older, pre-Christian Northern European understandings of the permeability between physical and spiritual realms. The graveyard feasts occupied a space where these traditions met and merged, where Orthodox Christian and pre-Christian Karelian understandings of death and commemoration enriched each other, creating practices that were distinctly local while also connecting to broader patterns. The graveyards as sacred space. For the twice-yearly feasts to work, the graveyards themselves had to be understood as sacred space, not simply land where bodies happened to be buried, but locations charged with spiritual significance. We've discussed in earlier episodes how the Lake Ladoga landscape was differentiated into sacred and mundane spaces. Graveyards were perhaps the most obviously sacred locations, places where the dead resided, where the boundary between worlds was always thin, where the living approached with particular reverence. But on Kekri Saturday and Easter Tuesday, this inherent sacredness intensified. The graveyards became not just sacred but activated, not just holy but functioning as active sites of communion between realms. The living took actions that reinforced this sacredness. They cleaned the graves before the feast, removing debris, straightening crosses, tending the sites with care. This was not merely practical maintenance but ritual preparation, making the space ready for the meeting of living and dead. They brought light, candles that illuminated the graveyard as darkness fell, creating pools of warmth and visibility in the gathering gloom. Light has symbolic and practical functions. It honors the dead, marks the graves as occupied and important, creates atmosphere appropriate for solemn joy. They brought abundance, more food than could possibly be consumed, wine poured liberally, offerings left generously. This abundance demonstrated that the dead deserved the best, that no expense should be spared in honoring them, that maintaining relationship with ancestors was worth significant material investment. The result was transformation of the graveyard from a normally quiet, sparsely visited place into a center of activity, noise, celebration, communion. For one day in autumn and one in spring, the graveyard became the most important location in the community, more important than homes, more important than churches, more important than any other space because it was where living and dead met. The cycle eternal. The refrain of the song emphasizes cyclical understanding, the eternal cycle turning, the living and the late. This is not linear thinking about time and existence. It's cyclical thinking where death and life, ending and beginning, are phases in an eternal round rather than absolute opposites. The agricultural cycle provided the model. Seeds planted in spring grew to harvest in autumn, then died back in winter, then sprouted again in next spring. Death was not ending but dormancy, not obliteration but transformation into new life. The yearly cycle followed the same pattern. The light and warmth of summer died into the darkness and cold of winter, then were reborn in spring. The cycle turned, eternal and reliable. Human existence participated in these same cycles. The living would die, becoming the late, a gentle euphemism, not the dead, but the late, those who are delayed, who will come later, who are in a different phase of the same cycle. And the late had once been living, had experienced the same seasons, the same harvests, the same feasts. Twice yearly feasting with the dead enacted this cyclical understanding. At Kekri, as the world descended into darkness and death, the living gathered with the dead to acknowledge their shared participation in the dying season. At Easter, as the world emerged into life and light, the living again gathered with the dead to celebrate resurrection and rebirth. The dead were not removed from the cycle but remained part of it, continued to participate in the turning of seasons, the alternation of death and life. They had moved from the living phase to the late phase, but they remained within the cycle, and the cycle would eventually bring everyone together again. This understanding provided comfort. Death was not exile to some distant, unknown realm but transition to a different phase of existence that remained connected to the living. The dead were not far away but near, in the graveyards, in the land, in the memory and hearts of those who continued living. And eventually, the living would join them. The cycle would turn. Those who now brought food to graves would themselves lie in graves while their children and grandchildren brought food to them. The feast would continue, the customs would be maintained, the eternal cycle would turn. Until we meet on that far shore, the songs promise that separation is temporary, that the cycle will eventually reunite all in whatever existence follows this one. The fading of the custom. By the time Theodor Schwint collected these stories in 1879, the graveyard feast traditions were already in decline. He notes the practices in past tense or describes them as things the old believers still did, implying that younger generations were abandoning or modifying them. Several factors drove this decline. Church pressure. Orthodox authorities had always been ambivalent about practices that seemed too folk-oriented, too focused on material offerings to the dead rather than proper liturgical commemoration. As institutional church power grew and clergy became better trained in official theology, pressure increased to discourage or suppress the graveyard feasts. Modernization. As education spread, as scientific worldviews gained influence, the literal belief that the dead could consume food or hear prayers seemed increasingly implausible to educated people. The feasts became embarrassing to those who wanted to appear modern and sophisticated. Social change. The graveyard feasts required intact communities with strong social cohesion. As people became more mobile, as villages depopulated with migration to cities or emigration abroad, the social structure supporting the customs weakened. Russification. In the late 19th century, Russian authorities promoted cultural uniformity, discouraging local customs that marked Karelians as distinct from Russians. Graveyard feasts were distinctly Karelian, making them targets for suppression. But the customs didn't disappear entirely, at least not immediately. Schwint found people who still practiced them, who could describe them in detail, who believed in their importance. The old believers maintained the traditions even as younger people abandoned them. And perhaps they persist still, in attenuated form. Visiting graves on particular days, leaving flowers or other tokens, speaking to the dead, these practices continue in many cultures, including modern Orthodox Christian practice. The full graveyard feast with food and wine may be rare, but the impulse behind it, to maintain connection with the dead, to honor ancestors, to enact belief that death does not sever relationship, this impulse persists. Universal patterns. The Lake Ladoga graveyard feasts are not unique in world cultures. Many societies have days of the dead when the living feast with or for the departed. Mexico's Dia de los Muertos, Day of the Dead, involves elaborate graveyard visits, offerings of food and drink to the dead, and belief that the dead return to feast with the living on this day. The Japanese Obon festival honors ancestral spirits with offerings, dances, and visits to family graves. The Chinese Qingming festival involves cleaning graves and making food offerings to ancestors. The ancient Roman Lemuria and Parentalia were festivals for honoring and appeasing dead family members. The pattern repeats across cultures. On specific days, the living gather at graves or in homes, offer food to the dead, believe the dead are present and participating, seek to maintain bonds across the boundary of death. This universality suggests something deep in human psychology and social structure. We need to maintain connection with those who came before us. We need to believe that death is not absolute ending. We need rituals that enact continuity across generations. The specific forms vary: when the feast occurs, what foods are offered, whether it happens in graveyards or homes or elsewhere. But the underlying pattern persists: the living and the dead feast together, the boundary between worlds grows thin, and continuity is maintained. Sitting at the grave. Return with me to that graveyard near Cumula, as evening approaches on Kekri Saturday. The feast has been underway since morning. The food has been eaten, most of it, though portions remain on graves as offerings. The wine bottles are nearly empty. Candles flicker at headstones as darkness gathers. Families sit together, some laughing, some weeping, some silent in contemplation. A mother sits at her infant's grave, speaking softly. An old man rests his hand on his wife's tombstone, his lips moving in prayer or conversation. A group of siblings gather at their parents' grave, sharing stories from childhood, laughing at memories decades old. The wind moves through the graveyard, rustling leaves, carrying smoke from the candles, bringing the scent of the lake from not far away. The sound of voices, speaking, singing, praying, blends with natural sounds, creating an atmosphere both solemn and celebratory. And in this moment, if you let yourself feel it, the dead do seem present. Not physically, not visibly, but present nonetheless. In the stories being told about them. In the memories being shared. in the food offered and the wine poured. In the conviction of the feastgoers that their ancestors are here, participating, blessing, listening. This is pomiluttaminen, mourning and celebration merged. This is Kalmistu, in the graveyard, the sacred ground where living and dead meet. This is libretto.fi, eternal memory, enacted not through abstract promises but through concrete practices of gathering, feeding, remembering, honoring. The cycle turns. The living become the late. The children become the ancestors. But the feast continues, the customs are maintained, the bonds persist. Or at least, they did persist, for centuries, until modernity and change slowly eroded them. But even in their fading, even in their reduction from lived practice to remembered custom to folklore collected by scholars like Schwint, they carry forward something essential about how humans relate to death, to ancestors, to the deep time of family and community. We are not isolated individuals existing only in the present moment. We are links in chains stretching back into the past and forward into the future. We are inheritors of those who came before and bequesters to those who will come after. We are temporary manifestations of something eternal, family, community, humanity itself. The graveyard feasts enacted this understanding. By sitting at graves, by feeding the dead, by speaking to ancestors, by celebrating in the presence of tombstones, the people of Lake Ladoga enacted a profound truth: we are never only ourselves. We are always also our ancestors, our descendants, our community across time. The dead are never truly gone. They live on in us, in our memories, in the customs we inherit from them, in the stories we tell about them. And someday, we will be the dead, and our descendants will gather at our graves, or remember us in whatever forms memory takes in their time, and we will live on in them. The eternal cycle turning. The living and the late. Together in the graveyard, together in memory, together in the communion that death cannot finally sever. Kalmistu, where the old believers sleep. Pomiluttaminen, mourning but also celebrating. Libretto.fi, eternal memory. Until we meet on that far shore.